Good morning, and thanks for joining us here on The Real Story. I'm Emma Wulfhorst. This election, these presidential candidates are moving at a historic and unbelievable pace. Today, we caught up with Connecticut Senator Chris Murphy. So, Senator Murphy, you have been so busy all over the place for the past few weeks, especially this week, not only filling in and doing your Senate duties, but, really acting as a warrior for the Harris-Walz campaign and what Democrats are trying to capitalize on as really a new wave of energy for the party. So I want to start, how does the party keep up this momentum across the country, across the ballot, and, even past the election?
Well, I think there's, going to be a renewed burst of energy after the vice president's performance at the debate. I was honored to, be there as part of her surrogate team. So I saw firsthand what a great job she did. She was presidential. She was commanding. She had specific ideas for how she's going to help people in this country. In Connecticut, it's, specific music to our ears to hear her talk about housing prices. She's got a very detailed plan to bring down the cost of rent, the cost of mortgages, and that's what we need in our state. Donald Trump was all over the place. He was angry. He was stumbling. He just didn't look like somebody who's ready to lead. Kamala Harris did. I think what's most exciting to me is how many young people are, signing up and joining this campaign, including that night. One of the heroes of, many young people in this country, Taylor Swift. The stakes are huge for young people, especially when it comes to women's health care and gun violence and climate change. So I think we have to continue to talk about issues that matter to everybody, but we have to especially focus on issues that matter to young people, because those are the folks that don't always come out in big numbers who may decide this election for Kamala Harris.
Now, one of the issues, though, that we have been hearing is a big sticking point for a lot of young people tends to be the war in Gaza right now. You did mention climate action goals, which we're hearing from young residents here as well. But a lot of people have been bringing up, and especially since the DNC, talking about feeling like maybe they're not being heard as much in the party. They want conditions or even an end to military aid for Israel. So how does the party really make sure everyone's being heard and sort of be that big umbrella, even when it comes to issues that can be sticking points or disagreements for people?
Well, this election is a choice. It's a choice between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. And if you care about ending the war in Gaza, if you care about a future Palestinian state, then the difference couldn't be bigger between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. Donald Trump does not support a Palestinian state. He would support Israel's annexation of the West Bank and likely of Gaza. He will write a complete total blank check to Prime Minister Netanyahu to continue his assault in Gaza and potentially expand it even deeper into the West Bank. So if you want Palestinians to have a future country and a future home, the only candidate that supports that is Kamala Harris. I think a lot of young people did hear her when she spoke to the country after meeting with Prime Minister Netanyahu. It's no secret that she cares deeply about the plight of Palestinians. Now, she's the vice president right now, so she is working with President Biden to try to get this ceasefire done, to end the war and to get the hostages released. She does support Israel's right to defend itself, but I think folks have heard loud and clear that she does have a very special concern in her heart for the number of civilians who have been killed and harmed by this war. And I would expect that you would hear more from her about that if she wins this race and is inaugurated as our next president.
You mentioned, obviously, there was that question about the situation in Gaza, about trying to get a ceasefire deal. As you said, she's obviously currently the vice president. She's been part of those discussions. You yourself, though, you're on the Foreign Relations Committee. You're part of defense appropriations. You have spoken out when some other members of the delegation haven't, about conditions on aid to Israel. And obviously the legislature controls the purse strings here. So how do you answer to constituents who maybe are wondering why this process is taking so long, or maybe why Congress hasn't seemed like it's acted thus far?
Well, I've been very clear about my position. Obviously, there came a point where I concluded that Israel's offensive inside Gaza was doing more harm to its own national security interests and to the United States national security interests, not because Israel doesn't have a right and an obligation to defend itself, but because there were just far too many Palestinians who were being killed. And ultimately, as we saw in Afghanistan, a cavalierness about civilian impact of a conflict can become really difference-making recruiting material for the terrorist groups that you are fighting. So I have been calling for months on Israel to stop this war and to focus in on the humanitarian catastrophe. I certainly have counseled the administration to use leverage in order to impact the decision of the Israeli government. But I also am fully cognizant of the fact that the quickest way to end this war is for Hamas to surrender. Hamas it says it cares about the people of Gaza. It does not. It does not. Hamas could end this war tomorrow by releasing these hostages and surrendering. So, yes, we often talk about this conflict in terms of the pressure the United States can apply to Israel, but it is also important to understand that Hamas has not just blood on its hands from October 7th, but every single day this conflict continues, a responsibility for the carnage and an obligation to do something about it. They should sign that ceasefire. They should end this war. So should Netanyahu, but Hamas needs to be at the table too.
When it comes to federal spending, not only is inflation making people wary, but you spoke this past week with the Atlantic Council about the hangover of doubt Americans have when it comes to foreign involvement, whether it's Vietnam to Afghanistan, the Middle East. There's also, a want, though, to still be competitive, be a leader on the global stage, whether it's political or in business. Post-debate now, as you've heard the candidates talk candidly about this, what are your reactions? What's the insight you want people to know from the chambers and your work when it comes to foreign relations?
Well, what I thought was one of the stunning moments from the debate was when Donald Trump was asked twice whether he wants Ukraine to win. He would not answer either time. And there's a simple reason for that, and we all know it. Donald Trump wants Russia to win. He basically told everyone during that debate that if he won the election before he was even sworn in, he would end the war. And given the fact that he wants Ukraine to win the war, he will end the war by cutting off U.S. support and handing Ukraine to Russia. I think there are a lot of people in Connecticut who do have questions about the amount of money that we give Ukraine. I support it, and I want to be involved in a dialogue with people to explain why it's important. But I meet almost no one in Connecticut who actively is rooting for Russia to win the war.
Right.
And Donald Trump is telling us that he is rooting for Russia to win. So once again, you have a huge difference here. Donald Trump, who wants Russia to win because he wants to get closer to dictators and autocrats like Vladimir Putin, and Kamala Harris, who's going to stand up for democracy and fight our enemies when we need to fight them.
Now, Trump, though, obviously has influenced Republican lawmakers greatly. A major example here, killing the bipartisan border bill. We've heard a lot of talk about this both before and now after the debate, and you were one of the architects of that bill. Harris now committing on the debate stage to helping make that happen if she were in the White House. Break down for us, though, what would actually be changing at the border if some form of that legislation were to be passed?
Yeah, so I was proud to be the Democratic author of the bipartisan border bill. I worked for 6 months on that bill. People in Connecticut told me that, whether or not Connecticut is a border state, the border is still a problem, and that it doesn't make people in Connecticut feel good that there are so many people who, kind of skip the line and come into the United States while other people are waiting for decades to be reunited with their family or get work in the United States. The bipartisan border deal would have invested $20 billion in new security on the border. It would have totally reformed the asylum process so that no longer does somebody get to stay in the United States for 10 years while their asylum claim is being processed. We'd get most of those claims done in weeks, if not months, and it would give the president the power to shut down the border discrete periods of time when there are too many people crossing. Those three reforms would have likely gotten the border under control. Now, the president went ahead and implemented many of those through executive action. I'm not sure that he has the legal authority to do that, but he did it. And what we saw is that they worked. Crossings are way down. They're lower today at the Mexican border than they were during Donald Trump. And I'm glad that Kamala Harris is saying, let's pass that bill. Donald Trump killed it because he wants the border to be a mess, because that's good for him politically. Kamala Harris says, let's pass tough bipartisan border legislation. Again, a huge contrast between the two parties. And I was, glad to hear her talk about that bill that I worked so hard on.
And last thing, quickly in our final minute here, we hear from Trump voters and those who are saying they will, support him no matter what, that they like the way what they call his plain spokenness and explaining, of issues in foreign policy. But we know that former President Trump is consistently lying, or at the very least going past the more normalized line of exaggeration in campaigns. This has seeped into other Republican lawmakers and candidates, some of them your colleagues. Do you think the Republican Party will shed this Trumpism if the election goes Harris's way, or do you think it's a little bit more embedded than that?
I don't know, fingers crossed. I'm not going to seek to predict what happens in the Republican Party. I couldn't have predicted the rise of Donald Trump. But he is not just hurting the country, he's hurting the party. The Republican Party used to be a party of ideas. My parents were both Republicans because the party stood for things, a strong defense, accountability in our schools. You were able to be pro-choice and an environmentalist inside the Republican Party. Now, if you even sniff at caring about climate change, you're drummed out of that party. So I hope that they move on from Trump, but I am done making predictions about what happens in politics generally and certainly within the Republican Party. I'll just keep my fingers crossed.
Well, Senator, thank you so much. As always, we know there's a lot else to watch, down ballot races in this election, one of them being yours. I'm sure we'll be checking in as we get closer to, but thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
We spoke with the Republican nominee challenging Murphy for his Senate seat, Matthew Corey. The Manchester businessman went over his platform and priorities with us. To see that segment, you can head to fox61.com or use the free Fox 61 News app. Just click on the tab at the top of your screen called The Real Story. Continuing with our election coverage this morning, we always say do your own research, but with so much said and so much at stake, we've compiled a whole bunch for you based on your questions. We're going to break down exactly what Trump and Harris's records are and plans. Are they battling for the White House? And of course, we're covering what impacts Connecticut the most, from taxes to student loans, the defense industry, and our state's reproductive health care laws. All that and more right ahead on The Real Story.